Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and I have for you something a bit different today. Thrift Store Horror is my collaborator on the channel. I use them for resources on what to read next and how to get books that I'm missing. And in some cases, I'm tracking down the wrong book entirely because it's the UK release and I already have the United States release. Anyway, recommendation was 13 Tales of Horror by 13 Masters of Horror. This is a compilation novel. It's all short stories. I have not read this before, but it came highly recommended by Thrift Store Horror. So we have stories by R.L. Stine, Caroline B. Cooney, Christopher Pike, D.E. Atkins, A. Bates, J. Bennett, Carol Ellis, Diane Ho, Lael Littke, Sinclair Smith, J.B. Stamper, Ellen Emerson White, and Patricia Windsor. Half of these authors have worked with Scholastic and Point Horror in the past. This should be pretty fun. And we all know about R.L. Stine and Christopher Pike, right? Believe it or not, I haven't really read any Diane Ho, or Sinclair Smith, or Caroline B. Cooney, but I do have a Cooney novel in the works, so stay tuned for that. I will be reading one story from this compilation and then publishing that as its own episode. I'm going to use this book like glue. If there's any holes or gaps or weirdness going on in my schedule, I'll be using one of these stories to fill that void. Just something fun to do. So let's begin. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the join button to show your support. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me narrate them a story. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. Welcome to Where the Deer Are by Caroline B. Cooney from 13 Tales of Horror. The houses on Fawn Hill were deep in the woods. Tiffany hated the woods, and the woods knew it. Other people could find a path and follow it, but for Tiffany, the trees lifted up branches like a teenage boy's leg in the aisle and tripped her. For other people, the woods sang quiet songs of nature and beauty. For Tiffany, the horrible tops of their grim gray branches rasped together like sore throats, infections that made it impossible to swallow. Whether she looked out the bedroom window, the kitchen window, the living room window, or any other window, her view was the same. Tall, thin, armless bodies of trees, so thin, like teenage anorexics. Gray complexions, peeling skin. In winter, you could see through the trees, but all you could see were more trees. In summer, green leaves closed up the woods, as dense as tent walls. Each school day, the neighborhood children left their homes and walked down long, rutted driveways. Fawn Hill was the name of their road. Tiffany had never seen a fawn. All the deer in the woods on Fawn Hill were the same, as if cut from mangy brown fake fur cloth and stuck through with pencil legs. In the way that doll babies are neither male nor female but just personoids, the deer on Fawn Hill were not bucks and not does. They were deeroids. Deer terrified her. They were supposed to be so pretty, but they weren't. Those deep brown eyes were no liquid pools. They were flat but full of knowledge. People shot the deer in season. Cars hit them year-round. Just last week her father had hit a deer. The deer had tried to cross Fawn Hill Road in the thick fog, but her father's wagoneer was there first, and the deer is nothing but a dent on the fender now. It lay there sunken, its brown eyes open and unchanged, looking just as alive, and just as not alive as before. Deeroid. Deer seems to be in her backyard more than anybody else's. Matthew said it was because of all the leafy shrubs and tasty flowers. Patrick said it was because Tiffany had a more open yard, a more relaxing passage from deep woods to meadow. But she knew better. It was because of her. They had their eyes on her. Even in the dark, Tiffany could feel their eyes on her. Those muddy, snow-melting, deeroid eyes. At the bottom of Fawn Hill Road, the children turned left onto Schoolhouse Road. The school was a quarter-mile away. The road wound to the right, curving steadily until it seemed certain to have made a complete circle. On the inside of the circle was a jagged rock face from which slabs of stone often fell. Trees grew sideways, their roots thrust into the cliff like pitchforks. Bushes clung to slick rocks with little green fingers. High up were ledges from which a 14-year-old could see the world, but 14-year-olds knew better than to climb the ledges. For this was Dead Kid Curve. This was where Kenny Morgan vanished and was never seen again. This was where Laura McMarkham paused to tie a shoelace. Her friends sauntered on, headed for school. Laura McMarkham screamed once, and only once. Her friends ran back, but Laura was not there. Laura was never there, or anywhere else again. Dead Kid Curve. Of course, no one really knew if Kenny or Laura were dead. They only knew that Kenny and Laura were gone. But that was a quarter of a century ago. Nobody who lived on Fawn Hill now knew the Morgans or the McMarkhams. Parents said that way back then, kids ran away from home a lot. Reporters had exaggerated things. Probably television had gotten in on it and made it appear scary, when all it was that Kenny decided to run away, and Laura had a boyfriend who picked her up in his car. None of the parents thought twice about it, but the children thought twice, and they knew. Walking under the cliff, they could feel what had happened to Kenny Morgan and to Laura McMarkham on Dead Kid Curve. Janie walked below the cliff now, and Matthew, Kelso, Tiffany, Patrick. These 5 walked to school. Nobody else followed the wrapping cliff. "One of us is chosen," said Janie. She had a slow, fluty voice, so high it was unnatural. Tiffany disliked the sound. She always wanted to clear her throat when Janie spoke. "The cliff has decided," said Janie, her voice fluttering like wings in trees. "It just hasn't told?" "Told what?" said Patrick nervously. "Which of us goes next?" said Janie. Her voice ended, still high, like an unfinished story. They never talked about the cliff. They were afraid of setting something off. Who knew what had made the cliff take Laura? Or Kenny? Who knew why it had waited a quarter of a century for another child? Tiffany never permitted herself to look up at the cliff. She never looked across the road into the woods either, the tightly bound bare trees of that woods, like gray soldiers linked arm to arm. Sometimes a deer materialized, and Tiffany would bite back a scream. You never saw a deer coming, never. It was just suddenly there. You saw a deer leave, though. It signaled you with its white tail, but it always vanished when it should still have been in sight. It seemed to be swallowed by the trees, as if a door had opened and the deer entered another room, or another world. Where do the deer go? Tiffany always wondered. You never see a fawn, thought Tiffany. It's as if they don't have babies anymore. It's the same grown-up deer being recycled. Tiffany was one of the race that shot them and ran them over. But mostly she was one of the race that built on their land and cut down their woods and put pavement on their meadows. She said, "Janie, don't talk about the cliff, or the woods, or the deer." "It's today," said Janie dreamily. "One of us will go today, I know it." Treetops rasped together. It sounded like cellar doors opening. Tiffany whirled to look behind her. For one breath, for one heartbeat, she knew. She saw. It was a door opening. She could see down the black hole, feel the horror and the emptiness. She tottered as if trying to back away from the long fall. "Jeanie, shut up," said Kelso. Kelso was the leader of the group. He was smaller than the rest, but braver and stockier. They all liked to walk next to Kelso when they circled the cliff, but Kelso liked to walk alone. Tiffany ran after Kelso and tried to take his hand. Kelso shook it free and shoved it into his pocket. Tiffany hung onto his denim jacket instead. "Don't stretch my jacket," said Kelso sternly. "Look," whispered Matthew, who rarely spoke. "There's a deer." Of course, everybody else wanted to stop and look. Everybody else thought deer were beautiful. Everybody else never tired of saying how graceful, how swift deer were. Again the treetops creaked and groaned. Again Tiffany whirled, quickly enough to see the cellar door open. She could see down, looking into truth and history. Now she knew. Somebody paid for everything. One generation paid for what another generation did. From ancient times, from the earliest story in the Bible, this was true. It didn't matter that you were innocent. The deer hit by the car were innocent, and it paid. She was sobbing and clutching. It was harder and harder to breathe. The air was being pumped in, shoved down her throat into her lungs. She could see where the deer were, among creeping roots and strangling branches, past dead moths and roadkills. "Don't step on my ankle, Tiffany," snapped Kelso. "Sorry." She jumped to match stride with Kelso. This way she could walk only an inch behind him and not yet tread on his ankle. Kelso gave her the look only he could give a girl, filled with disgust and loathing, but being polite anyway. She was caught in a fever of trees, a paralysis of deer. "Where do you suppose they go?" said Matthew. "Missing children?" said Kelso. "Laura and Kenny?" Matthew shook his head. "Deer." Kelso was scientific in his answer. "They have their own little paths and thickets." "But they just vanish," said Matthew. "I remember when my dad went hunting last fall. The deer ate our entire garden, and we saw them every day. But when we went up on top of the cliff, because that's where they have to live, you know. I mean, there are houses and roads and swimming pools everywhere else. We never found one. Never saw a trace or a dropping. Where do the deer go?" Patrick said, "Your father killed a deer last week, didn't he, Tiff?" A weird laugh percolated like drunken coffee in her throat. Her skull and the cliff quivered as if pounded by the hooves of 1,000 deer. Tiffany could look nowhere, or she would see the eyes of the deer, or the woods, or the cliff. Where are my fawns? Where is my wilderness? Why are there beer cans in my woods, and tracks of dirt bikes through my leaves? Matthew tried to lead them over the wood side of the road instead of the cliff side. Here, debris lay like a fence. Discarded hamburger wrappers, old liquor bottles, pieces of newspaper, and strips of tires. You had to look over the trash to see the woods, and as deep in as you looked, the woods was not pristine forest, but full of junk. There's even an old armchair, its stuffing spilling out like vomit into the winter leaves. A car door, without the car, was propped up against a twisted old evergreen. "We can't walk on the wood side of the road," said Janie firmly. "We wouldn't be facing traffic. We'd have our backs to oncoming traffic. It'd be Dead Kid Curve for real. We'll all be smashed by a truck." Janie knew her safety rules. Janie always knew things like where the fire extinguisher was kept. Janie was the sort of girl who wore a white jacket if it was the least little bit dark out, so cars would see her, even if she was in her own backyard and the only cars were parked in the garage. Kelso said he was going to climb the cliff and sit on the ledges up among the twisted pines. He would bring along his camera, said Kelso, and photograph the cliff from all angles, even the very top where nobody had ever been. That would set this Dead Kid Curve nonsense to rest. "It's not resting," said Tiffany. "Don't you feel it quivering?" Kelso scoffed. "Sympathetic vibration from the train tracks." But the train tracks were miles away. "Dragons, maybe, Tiff?" said Kelso, raising his eyebrows to make Tiffany feel infantile. "Evil spirits? So Kenny Morgan and Laura McMarkham had a bad year. It's been 25 years. What's this evil spirit been doing all that time?" "Don't say their names out loud," whispered Janie. "Today is the day the cliff chooses." "I wouldn't mind so much," said Patrick, "what the cliff does as long as we all go together." It wouldn't work that way, Tiffany knew. It would single one of them out. The rest would neither see nor understand. All their lives, the other four would wonder and wake screaming and weep in the night, but they would not know. Kelso sighed heavily. "You guys can worry about anything you want, but I personally am going to worry about whether I make the soccer team." Tiffany stopped short, and Matthew bumped into her. "You know we don't stop on the way to school," said Matthew urgently. "Keep going, Tiff." "Do you hear that?" breathed Tiffany. "Hear what?" "That sound. Do you hear it calling?" Kelso was irritated. "The wind is right. You can hear the marching band practicing." But Tiffany could hear nothing except her own leaping heart. She looked up where groping pines blocked the sky, tilting over the road, losing their balance. "It's calling me," she said. Janie was right. It had been decided. Tiff could hear her name, spun in high, airborne notes like dead leaves. The leaves of last fall. The leaves of last year. But she did not think it was a cliff after all. It was the deer. Tiffany's eyes opened very wide. They were bluer than before. They had become part of the sky. Her thin jacket was the hard green of the pines, and her fingers were mottled like the rocks she pressed together. Kelso grabbed Tiffany's arm. "We'll be late for school," he said. He looked fiercely at Matthew, who obediently took Tiffany's other arm, and the two of them marched her forward like a prisoner. It doesn't matter, Tiffany thought. The cellar door opened. I'm the one who saw. I'm next. Patrick was skipping ahead, looking out the corners of his eyes to be sure the others were right behind. Tiffany clung to Matthew and Kelso. She would even have held hands with Janie at this point, although Janie was the worst sort of girl, whiny and always worried about ruining her shoes by stepping in a puddle. Finally, the roof of the school appeared. It was slanted with reddish-brown tiles, the only tiled roof Tiffany had ever seen. There was something about terracotta that was warm and safe, and Tiffany said, "There's school." She had been holding her breath and not even known it. "We're here," she said, removing a quiver from her voice. "There's school," she repeated, feeling warm and safe. Kelso said, "Where's Janie?" Time to run into the school, slam and lock the doors behind them, and call the police, the fire department, the FBI, and their mothers. Matthew stood very still, apparently feeling that whatever it was would pass by him, mistaking him for a telephone pole or a tree. Patrick giggled. His face didn't match. His face was frowning and sobbing while his mouth giggled. Tiffany kept busy with a demented combination of whimpering and gulping. Kelso said, "Shut up. Come on. We're going back to find her." He strode away, marching back to Dead Kid Curve. Patrick, Matthew, and Tiffany stood desperately, eyes swiveling back and forth between the warm red-tiled safety of the school and the cold rock tower of the cliff. "Rats," said Patrick gloomily. "I hate it when you have to be a hero." He ran after Kelso. Matthew uttered a tiny cry, like a bird hitting a windshield, and joined the boys. Tiffany thought, "Nothing will make me go back there. Nothing." It got Janie. It was calling to me, but the boys held on to me and I escaped, and it had to take her instead. Tiffany ran into school, into the safe warmth, into the wonderful homey smell of lockers and pencil lead, copy paper, and old sneakers. "They'll find Janie," she promised herself. "Janie, something reasonable, and they'll find her." Tiffany's chest was rising and falling with such rapidity that she no longer felt human. Perhaps she was a hummingbird whose tiny heart beat 200 times a minute. She was burning hot and freezing cold at the same time. Her clothes were slithery and alien like reptile skin. She staggered to the nearest girl's room to look at herself. The varnish on the door had split, alligatoring the finish. The 5 letters were stenciled off-center and tilted, as if the door had been through a convulsion. GIRLS. She pushed at the door. How heavy it was, how slowly it yielded. She had to use her entire body to wedge herself in. The lights were not on. With her right hand, Tiffany fumbled over the wall for the switch. She found nothing. The bathroom tiles were slimy. She stepped further into the room. The door closed behind her with the breathy thud of a perfect fit. The room was fat with silence. She felt her body expanding, like the dead deer on the road going bad, felt herself balloon, and felt the switch, and turned it on. One fluorescent ceiling tube trembled with effort and half lit the space. Shadows crept up, feeling the backs of Tiffany's legs. 3 mirrors over 3 sinks leered at her, dark and blind as stones. There was a deer in the mirror. Not Tiffany, who stood in front of it, but a deer, soft and brown and muddy. She tried to scream, but her lips were knit together. She tried to back up, but her feet had swollen, making movement almost impossible. Her sky-blue eyes opened wide enough to burst, but the eyes that looked back were flat and deeroid. And then there was something sharp and dark in the mirror, something climbing out. A dainty hoof coming right out of the mirror, pointing at Tiffany, pursuing her. First one deer leg, thin as a broken pencil, and then the next. Tiffany fell out of the bathroom like cereal from a box, into the hall. An empty hall and an empty school. The door closed in its heavy mechanical way. The school was silent. There was nobody there. Nothing happened. Not a sound, not a breath, not a creak. "There's no school today," thought Tiffany. "I'm alone in here? But—" The girl's room door began to open. Out came a single leg, like something cooking in a stew pot. She could hear little sounds now, and she knew they were her whimpering. She ran out of the school, across the wide parking spaces, over the soggy grass, onto Schoolhouse Road. No traffic, no cars, no humans. But yes, deer. In the woods among the trees, all the deer that had vanished during hunting season stood still, staring at her. Their eyes were like brown hubcaps, huge and glistening. "I'm innocent," she thought. But the deer neither saw nor understood. Their flat, dead eyes just reflected more deer. Home, Tiffany thought. I have to go home. Home would be warm, and have 4 walls and a radio playing. Home would be human, and it would last, and there would be cookies. Home would have no deer, no woods, no cliff. She began to run, with the cliff on her left now, and the woods thick with deer, woods that hardly had trees, so full of deer they were, on her right. The cellar door rasped. "It's treetops. Don't look. It's just trees." She tried to stare only at the road, the man-made road, tried to think man-made thoughts, nothing of woods, nothing of deer. But the death of the deer and the demise of the woods was also man-made. There was no getting away from what was man-made. She would disappear, and that would not be man-made. It would be deer-made. Far, far away she saw Kelso, Matthew, Patrick. Far, far away, as if through binoculars, she saw Janie with them. Perhaps Janie had forgotten her homework, or her freshly laundered gym suit. Janie had to be perfect, or else. Tiffany heard the hum and the rhythm of the woods. For a moment she was all of it, hunter, hunted, and remains. She was the roadkill. She was the deer that had been hit and left. "It's not my fault," she cried. "I didn't build the house. I didn't drive the car." The trees rasped. She tried to close her eyes. If she did not see the cellar door opening, she could not go in. This is where the deer are, she thought. They have their own doors to their own world. The trees rasped. The hands of the woods were rubbing together with glee. They had one another. They had Tiffany. She tried to call to Kelso, who would save her. Kelso waved. She tried to call to Janie, who had known one of them was going today. Janie shifted her book bag. The door opened. Tiffany tried to step around it. It just spread wider, like a smile. "I'm sorry I scared you," said Janie. "No problem," said Kelso. "My mother gets angry if she makes me a sandwich and I forget to bring it," said Janie. "No problem," said Kelso. Tiffany saw the laughing deer, the sneering underside of the road, the strangling vines above the ground and beneath the soil. The trees closed around her like shovels full of dirt on a coffin. Her feet struggled with the edge of the cellar, so for a moment she seemed to be dancing with the deer. Tiffany began the long fall. She knew the fall would never end. She would never catch up to Kenny Morgan or Laura McMarkham. She was alone and falling, and in the dark forever and ever. The trees rasped. The wind breathed. The deer vanished. "Where do you suppose the deer go?" asked Janie. Kelso shrugged. "Who cares?" he said. "In a few years, there won't be any deer around here anymore anyway." Kelso finished the soda he had taken from the bag lunch his mother had carefully packed. He threw the can into the woods. It glittered, scarlet and silver, like a marker on a grave. This has been a Nightfall Audiobooks production of Where the Deer Are by Caroline B. Cooney from 13 Tales of Horror. Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and thank you very much for joining me for my production of Where the Deer Are by Caroline B. Cooney. I don't think I've read Caroline B. Cooney before. This was a fun little read. I like her writing style. I like how Janie was able to look into the woods. I like how Tiffany was able to realize that the woods needed a sacrifice from a child in order to keep things in balance in the town that they live in, especially on Fawn Hill. The little thing about Dead Kid Curve was kind of fun too. It lends an air of mystery and legends to the area with the other two kids when they went missing. I like the twist where everyone turns around once they get to school and they realize that Janie is gone, but she really just ran back home, grabbed her lunch, and came back. And somehow she made it all the way through Dead Kid Curve by herself and okay, but Tiffany was the one that was taken as a sacrifice instead. I liked the imagery here. I liked the idea of the trees rasping together, and they are working in concert with the deer to select a child to take as a sacrifice. If you have seen the movie Cabin in the Woods, this is the same kind of idea. Cabin in the Woods was about an ancient evil that needed a sacrifice once a year that was selected at random and without influence in order to keep the world in balance. So you get the jock, the stoner, the valley girl, the virgin, the intellectual, and one of them is chosen at random to die, and without that death, the end of the world occurs. It's a really, really fun movie. I recommend that you watch it if you haven't. The end scene is just bananas, so enjoy the last half hour of that movie. I like this short story. This was really, really fun. So thank you very much for listening and for joining me on this little experiment with 13 Tales of Horror. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also at home right here on YouTube, at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the join button to show your support. Any help is greatly appreciated. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me, tell them Tales of Horror. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.